This is Jim Fetzer, the conspiracy guy, where tonight I'm addressing the question of what happened to JFK. Did the Warren Commission get it right? This is an issue of great interest. It drew me into conspiracy research way back when in 1991. In 1992, in the aftermath of the release of Oliver Stone's magisterial film JFK. Whereas most of you are aware, I am a former Marine Corps officer, a university professor, now retired. I publish widely on academic issues like AI, computer science, artificial intelligence, evolution, and mentality, perhaps most notably on the nature of scientific reasoning, scientific laws, and scientific explanation, where I have published in my recent days, in addition to over 24 scholarly works, over a dozen books in the area of assassination research, including 6 published at Moonrock Books, which have been banned by Amazon.com. We have altogether 12, 6 of which I have edited, actually 8, but where 6 of those have been banned by Amazon because they provide too much truth. I apply scientific reasoning to complex and controversial cases such as JFK, 9/11, Wellstone, Sandy Hook, the Boston bombing, typically bringing together groups of experts in order to sort out what actually happened in accordance with the principles of scientific reasoning, which entail 4 steps or stages. Puzzlement. Something doesn't fit into your background knowledge and experience. For example, if the Secret Service is providing masterful protection to the President of the United States, how could a single allegedly demented gunman have been able to kill him? Speculation. What are the possible alternative explanations of what's taken place? Well, maybe the official account that's formulated in the Warren Commission didn't get it right. Right. Maybe we've been given information intended to mislead us. What are the probabilities of the available evidence on the alternatives? Well, we have to get straight which of the evidence is authentic and which is not, because then it becomes relatively straightforward to determine which hypothesis confers a higher probability upon the evidence, where the discovery that some evidence has been altered, changed, or fabricated can provide an invaluable clue as to who is responsible, since the parties who could have manufactured the evidence are very likely to be a very small set. And when the evidence is settled down, we're entitled to accept the best supported hypothesis as true in the tentative, infallible fashion of science. Tentative, insofar as with the acquisition of new evidence or alternative hypotheses, we may have to reject hypotheses we previously accepted, accept hypotheses we previously rejected, and leave others in suspense. And fallible in the sense that even the best supported scientific hypothesis or theory, such as classical Newtonian physics, which is thought to be true for all regions of space and time, turned out to be but a special limiting case of Einstein's more general theory of relativity, so that a paradigm of what was thought to be scientific certainty was shown to be only a special limiting case and therefore literally false, which ought to be a sobering lesson for us all. Meanwhile, I emphasize a methodological difference between looking for confirming instances of an hypothesis, such as in relation to all pennies are made of copper, adducing billions of examples of copper pennies as confirmation, versus a falsificationist methodology, testing hypotheses to see whether they can be shown to be false, where it turns out in 1943, because of the shortage of copper for military purposes, it turns out they were made of steel, so that an hypothesis that has billions of confirming instances nevertheless turns out to be false. Well, the Warren Commission summarizes the government's official position. It was published in 1994 after having been formed by President Lyndon Johnson, where the FBI was delegated as a sole investigative agency, which had the effect of cutting off about 15 different inquiries, including in the state of Texas, in the House and the Senate, and consolidating them in one single entity, the authenticity of which or accuracy of which has been widely disputed, but where it told us that a lone Dominion gunman, Lee Oswald, a former Marine, interestingly, fired 3 lucky shots from the 6th floor of the Texas book depository window, as shown here, scoring 2 hits and 1 miss. Interestingly, the day of the assassination, both the FBI and the Secret Service concluded there had been 3 shots with 3 hits, that Jack had been hit in the back, that Connolly had been hit in the back, and then Jack had been hit in the back of the head, killing him. But when it would eventually emerge that a shot had missed and injured a distant bystander by the name of James Tague, who was down around here, around the number 6 location, they had to contract the number of shots that actually hit from 3 to 2, leading to the introduction of what's known as the magic bullet theory, which we shall review. In any case, you'll see the motorcade came down Main Street and then took a right onto Houston and 110 degree onto Elm Street, which interestingly was a violation of Secret Service protocols. Among other buildings of note, the County Records Building, the Dow Tax, and of course the area known as the Grassy Knoll, including the wooden fence, where Elm Street would disappear under the triple underpass, and where, you know, each of these will figure in what I shall explain in assessing the evidence, where the Warren report is supposed to be based upon medical reports about the wounds sustained by the president, supplemented by photographic and other proof that Lee Oswald was a lone assassin, including the Zapruder film and other home movies as visual confirmation, where if any of them turns out to be flawed, then the Warren report cannot be sustained. Indeed, this photograph that was published on the cover of Life magazine was used to impress upon the public that this man had both a motive and the means to kill the president, and by virtue of being an employee at the book depository, had the opportunity, where he's holding the Mannlicher Carcano rifle, a single-shot bolt-action rifle with which he is alleged to have killed the president, a revolver with which he's supposed to have shot a police officer, J.D. Tippit, and where he's holding 2 communist newspapers, The Worker and The Militant, that are intended to demonstrate his political orientation and motivation as a communist. Indeed, the government has also presented us with a 27-second film of the assassination known as the Zapruder film. Take a look. Here you see some of the leading motorcycles. Then all of a sudden, boom, you see the motorcade there. We don't see it turning from Houston onto Elm. Notice the Stedman Freeway sign obfuscates. Then you see the president hit in the head. Each of the frames has a frame. The frame where he's hit in the head is 313. And then you see the motorcade disappear under the triple underpass. I'll show it once more and we'll return to it again. But notice the continuity of motion here. We don't see what happened, even though Abraham Zapruder, who purportedly took the film, said he filmed continuously from when the motorcade came into view in Houston. So we're missing what turned out to be about 100 frames of the turn from Houston onto Elm. And then if Larry Rivera has it right, about 4 times that many additional frames, because according to the latest research we shall review, the limousine actually was brought to a halt to make sure the president would be killed. Now, it's fascinating that if you went back to live coverage that day on NBC, See It Now, for example, you'd see noted newsmen of the time, such as Chet Huntley, reporting through two wounds that were widely described on radio and television that afternoon. First was a shot to the throat, which Malcolm Perry, the MD at Parkland Hospital, who performed a simple tracheostomy incision through the wound, described as a wound of entry 3 different times during the Parkland press conference, a transcript of which was never made available to the Warren Commission. And subsequently, after Malcolm Kilduff, the acting press secretary, reported that JFK had been killed by a shot through the head pointing to his right temple, which had been fired from the right front and blown out the back of his head, which was attributed to Admiral George Berkeley, the president's personal physician. So if you put together those 2 wounds that were widely described on radio and television that day, with the 2 that the Warren Commission was insisting had taken place, namely the shot to the back and a shot to the back of the head, then you can see that JFK apparently sustained a minimum of 4 wounds that day, where David W. Manick, the leading expert on the medical evidence, has concluded that there may yet have been a 3rd shot to the head. Meanwhile, perhaps the greatest challenge to the Warren Commission was Oliver Stone's brilliant film, JFK, released in 1991, where it's here being denigrated by the unkind description of it as a crackpot theory about the assassination, which won Oscars for cinematography and editing. Oliver posited 3 different hit teams rather than a single solitary shooter. His work was based upon the assumption that Lee Oswald was in the book depository on the 6th floor, and that the Zapruder film was authentic, where in our review we'll discover grounds to question both of those assumptions, as well as his characterization of only 3 teams of shooters, where there now appears to have been many more. Let's begin with the medical evidence. The magic bullet theory actually moves the wound from the back about 5.5 inches below the collar upward. This is from Gerald Posner's book, Case Closed, where he seeks to be equivocal about it, because we actually have the shirt and the jacket that show holes 5.5 inches below the collar, slightly lower in terms of the shirt. That's supposed to have passed through his neck and exited to account for what Malcolm Perry had described as a throat wound of entry, to turn it into a wound of exit and go into John Connolly's back. So instead of having that official 3-shot sequence of the back, and the back of the head, now subtracting one of those wounds, we have to tie together the back wound with the front wound from the throat to turn it into an exit to accommodate only a 2-shot scenario where the same bullet that passed through Jack passed through John Connolly. Here's the jacket. You can see the wound's about 5.5 inches below the collar. This was left behind at Parkland, as was the shirt. David Bantic, on one of his visits to the archives, actually had a member of the staff put on the shirt and the jacket and ascertained that the hole in the shirt is ever slightly below the hole in the jacket, which would be, of course, appropriate were the round fired from above, not necessarily, and behind somewhere, but whether left or right is another matter. Here you can see the wound actually identified by J. Thornton Boswell, who was assisting James Holmes in the pathology. This is an uncertified, but here's a certified by Admiral Berkeley, the president's personal physician. Good reason to believe, in fact, there was a wound here in the back. And also it indicates a wound to the back of the head here, about the location of the external occipital protuberance, roughly where you'd rest your head in a bathtub if you were so declining. And two FBI agents actually observed the assassination autopsy at Bethesda. And this is Siebert and O'Neill, where Siebert took diagrams and noted the back wound was lower than the throat wound, making it highly unlikely that a wound fired from above and behind that entered there had exited the throat. Meanwhile, we have the Admiral Berkeley's death certificate on JFK. It describes his death as having been struck in the head by an assassin's bullet, but also adds a second wound occurred at the posterior back at about the level of the third thoracic vertebrae. Well, that's very telling, because the third thoracic vertebrae is around here, where you can see this large patch in the back is where even the Warren Commission staff, in conducting a reconstruction, located one wound and then the other at the back of the head. Notice, fascinating. Here's one of my favorite photograph from the assassination, which is Senator Arlen Specter, to whom the magic bullet theory is attributed, using a pointer to illustrate the trajectory the bullet would have had to have taken to have hit John Connally in the back, where he sustained multiple wounds. And yet, if you look below his hand to where the patch is in the back, the photograph actually refutes the magic bullet theory by showing it did not enter at the location Arlen Specter was specifying. Indeed, it turned out that the New York Times would publish on 3 July 1997, based upon a release of documents from the commission's records, that Gerald Ford had changed the description of the back from his uppermost back, which was already an exaggeration, to the back of his neck, which was a very significant alteration. Although Ford claimed his change had nothing to do with a conspiracy theory, it's apparent that, in fact, this was the introduction of an impossible scenario to account for all the wounds based upon only 2 shots, where David Mandick has taken a patient with similar chest and neck dimensions and plotted the official account of the entry in the accident, discovered it's not even anatomically possible because cervical vertebrae shown here intervene. So what we've got from the government is really a preposterous account where the bullet actually enters 5.5 inches below the collar, or on the jacket shirt 5 3/4, and then makes a physically impossible move to come out the throat and to go into the back of John Connally, where when it exited Connally's chest, it hit his right wrist and wound up in his left thigh. And yet the bullet shown here is actually in virtually pristine condition with some longitudinal twist, but otherwise relatively intact. And where even John Connally's physician observed that he thought it was highly unlikely that this bullet had performed the feats attributed to it, since he had removed more metal from John Connally's wrist than was missing from the bullet. We have multiple witnesses to the head wound then at Dealey Plaza, at Parkland, and at Bethesda. Here you see quite a range: Beverly Oliver, Phil Willis, Marilyn Willis, Ed Hoffman, all of whom were at Dealey Plaza observing. Beverly opposite the grassy knoll, Phil and Marilyn on the grassy knoll, Ed Hoffman on the triple underpass overlooking, all of whom saw a blowout at the back of the head. Then you have a series of physicians and nurses at Parkland, including Robert McClellan, Paul Peters, Kenneth Salyer, Charles Carrico, Richard Delaney, Charles Crenshaw, Ronald Jones, and Nurse Audrey Bell. We even have Theron Ward, the Justice of the Peace, and the ambulance driver, Aubrey Roink. Then from Bethesda, in addition, Frank O'Neill, the other FBI agent, Gerald Custer, Paul O'Connor, Floyd Reedy, all who were medical technicians assisting with the autopsy. It's very interesting how in a book entitled The Kennedy Detail, which talks about the performance of the Secret Service in Dealey Plaza, we have the agent who rushed forward to save Jackie, giving his repeated testimony here. Clint Hill by name, a bit older than in the old days, at a Warwick's in San Diego, talking about how he had rushed up to push Jackie back, that he'd laid across their bodies in the back seat, and then he'd been the first to witness this massive blowout at the back of the head. Here are words from Clint Hill. As I lowered the top of the back seat, I noticed a portion of the president's head on the right rear side was missing, and he was bleeding profusely. Part of his brain was gone. I saw part of his skull with hair on it, which is consistent with certain frames of the film that we shall review, but not with the official Warren report. This record was in Warren Commission CE 1024, so some of its members and staff had to be aware of it. Even the Kennedy detail include this sentence: and slumped across the seat, President Kennedy lay unmoving, a bloody, gaping, fist-sized hole clearly visible in the back of his head. And an observation of enormous significance in relation to the autopsy photographs and x-rays, as well as to the authenticity of the film. Here you see the acting press secretary pointing to his right wrist, Malcolm Kilduff, and indicating it was simply a matter of a bullet right through the head. We have Robert, one of the witnesses at the physicians at the Bethesda, who had authorized this diagram. It was a massive wound. Charles Crenshaw, another of the physicians, drew for me a wound both from the back and from the side, so you could see the elements of the damage, which I included in Assassination Science as the first appendix. David W. Mantic, however, who went in to study the autopsy x-rays, noticed there's no blowout at the back of the head. He told me before he entered the archives that he thought he'd find evidence that the autopsy had been altered, but also evidence of a second shot to the head, namely a distribution of metallic particles, which may have been mercury, so that he actually found both. Because notice here it appears, given the diagram from Dr. McClellan, for example, that the x-ray had been patched, which David actually discovered himself using optical densitometry, a method he knew from physics, being the possessor of both an earned PhD in physics from the University of Wisconsin and an MD from the University of Michigan, and being board certified in radiation oncology, which is a treatment of cancer using X-ray therapy. Witnesses to the throat wound included at Dealey Plaza at Parkland and at Bethesda. Here's Malcolm Perry, who described that wound to the throat as a small, clean puncture wound, a wound of entry 3 different times. Here's Kemp Clark, who is the head of neurosurgery at Parkland. Dr. Crenshaw drew for me the wound both before and after the simple straight incision by Malcolm Perry, and it's very obvious this is a wound of entry. Indeed, it was widely described, as I mentioned, on radio and television, leading Bob Livingston, who was a scientific director of 2 of the National Institutes of Health of Neurological Diseases and Blindness, to call over to Commander Humes later that afternoon or early evening to tell him that since there'd been this wound to the throat that was obviously a wound of entry, the neck had to be dissected very carefully. And if there were any evidence of shots from behind, then we would know there were at least 2 shooters and therefore a conspiracy, at which point the Secret Service or FBI cut him off, which troubled him profoundly, as he reported in his contributions to Assassination Science. Now, this is a photograph allegedly from the autopsy that's curious in several respects. Notice the right ear looks very, very strange. Notice the eyes are open. Charles Crenshaw was the last physician to observe the body before it was wrapped in sheets and placed into a bronze ceremonial casket, and he closed JFK's eyes. Notice, too, the wound is now no longer a small, clean puncture wound. Well, it turns out Commander Humes had called Bob Livingston later that evening to ask what the wound would look like to the throat if it had been a wound of accident. And it appears, based upon Bob's description, where he was an expert on wounds, having supervised an emergency medical hospital during the Battle of Okinawa for injured Okinawans and Japanese prisoners of war, that Humes used Bob's description to alter the wound to make it more like a wound of accident. We'll return to whether this body really is that of JFK. David Lifton, by the way, had done completely brilliant work early on and had even suggested that there'd been alteration to the body in his brilliant book, Best Evidence, published in 1980, from which, when I became serious about doing assassination research, I learned more than I did from any other source. Now, this is a very famous photograph here taken by Associated Press photographer James Ike Alchins, and there are many features here of significance, including, if you look carefully, you can see there's a small white spiral nebula in the windshield where JFK is already clutching his throat. The bullet, a bullet fired from in front that hit Jack in the throat, passed through the windshield. You can see here, and we'll do a close-up momentarily. There's an area here in the background where a figure leaning out, known as Doorman, bears a striking resemblance to Lee Oswald, who, if he had been in the doorway watching the motorcade pass by, he cannot at the same time have been in the sixth floor window firing at JFK, where the Secret Service agents are looking around as though they have no idea what's going on, where there's a window of the Dow Tex. This turns out to be from a uranium mining company that was a CIA asset, from which 3 shots were fired here using a Mannlicher Carcano, and I think you can even see the rifle extending here, and where Lyndon Johnson seems to have disappeared, although his security detail is responding really faster than JFK's, which is rather surprising, unless, of course, Lyndon knew what was going to transpire. Here you can see on the left the small white spiral nebula with a dark hole in the center, indicative of a through-and-through hole, where the beveling was on the inside. So it was from out to in, which would be confirmed by an official at Ford Motor Company who replaced the windshield under instructions from the Secret Service or J. Edgar Hoover or the president himself, where he replaced it with a clean new windshield, but where the Secret Service would later produce yet a third windshield that had spider-like cracks caused by, they claimed, a fragment of a bullet from behind. This was an obvious fabrication of evidence. You can even see the hole through the windshield in frame 225 of the Zapruder film. Meanwhile, the mortician who prepared the body for burial told an investigator in May 26th of 1992, where the mortician was named Thomas Evan Robinson, that in addition to a large gaping hole in the back of the head, there was a small wound in the right temple and a wound on the back 5 to 6 inches below the shoulder, just to the right of the spinal column. Now, there's what's known as a skull flap kind of sticking out here by his right ear that was crescent-shaped, flapped down about 3 inches up on the side, and small shrapnel wounds to the face, which he had to pack with wax, which he discovered when he was embalming the body for burial, that embalming fluid was leaking out, that there were no, that the brain had been removed, and the adrenaline glands, that other organs had been removed and then put back, but where there was no swelling or discoloration to the face, meaning JFK died instantly in Dealey Plaza. Now, the Warren Commission was basing some of its findings on the Zapruder film, and you'll notice here, this is frame 312, just before the hit at 313, and you'll see in 314, 315, 316, 317, you cannot see any blowout to the back of the head. Now, what David Lifton referred to as the blob is here, which seems to have been moved from the back of the head to the side. Here you see it again and again to mislead, because it would suggest it was a blow up to the right front. But even Jackie Kennedy in her testimony to the Warren Commission said, from the front he looked just fine, but that she had a terrible time holding his skull and brains together at the back of the head. When the House Select Committee reinvestigated the case in 1977-78, however, its medical panel concluded that the entry wound, which the Bethesda physicians had located right around here, had actually been 4 inches above at the crown of the head, where it's seen here in the diagram, but not visible in the photographs. Here's the skull flap I was talking about. And notice the right ear looks very, very weird. The skull flap, 3 inches, crescent shape, blown open from a frangible or exploding bullet. Fascinating. What this means, however, is that since there was a massive piece of skull missing from the back of the head, known as the Harper fragment, because a medical student by the name of Billy Harper found it Saturday, which David had placed at the back of the head, that the House Select Committee reconstruction can't even account for the Harper fragment, which means it was a massive cover-up headed by, a former medical examiner for New York City. I mean, this is very, very shocking and embarrassing when you look at it, that it appears that the medical panel for the House Select Committee was trying to redo the cover-up even better than it had been done originally before. Meanwhile, notice, just in confirmation of the blood at the back of the head, we have one after another of the Parkland doctors describing extruding cerebellar as well as cerebral tissue, where the cerebellum is a small, compact part of the brain at the base, right on top of the brainstem. It could not possibly have been extruding unless it was a massive blowout at the back of the head. So you got Marion Jenkins, Charles Carrico, Malcolm Perry, Robert McClellan, Charles Baxter, Kenneth Clark, Charles Crenshaw. Look, Kemp Clark is a director of neurosurgery. And here's his Warren Committee testimony. Cerebral and cerebellar tissue being damaged and exposed, talking about the loss of cerebellar tissue through this massive blowout to the back of the head, which really leaves no doubt about it. It would turn out that the Parkland physicians would greatly increase the size of the wound, but there would be witnesses observing as they did it, including Thomas Evan Robinson, who would prepare the body for burial. So here's the blowout at the back of the head in Parkland, which we have every reason to believe is completely correct, where the blowout was patched, as Dr. Mandic discovered, by imposing material that was too dense to be human bone, where Commander Humes actually took a cranial saw to enlarge in the wound to try to make it look more like something that would have occurred had JFK been bending way over forward and shot from behind. That appears to have been the objective, where it's described in mathematical precision in the Warren Commission autopsy report, which I included as an appendix to Assassination Science. So it's inescapable that there was this massive wound, which Robinson is reported, where he was accompanied by another medical tech there. They both confirmed when the Assassination Records Review Board sought to depose him and showed him a diagram with a dotted line, Robinson said, "Oh no, the doctors did that," meaning greatly enlarging the wound, but where then the House Select Committee sought to cover it up by reconstituting the back of the head. I mean, this is about as manifest and blatant an absurdity as the world has ever seen from the point of view of medical evidence. Just notice 3 different versions of the wound to the back of the skull, where David Lifton was the first to pick up on the claim of surgery to the head, which the FBI agents reported having been observed by Commander Humes to cover up what he himself had already done. So that if you put all the wounds together that we've been addressing, then JFK was hit in the back of the head by that shot, which turns out to have been fired from the top of the county records building, by a Dallas deputy sheriff. He was shot in the throat by a wound fired from the inside of the triple underpass by an Air Force expert, it would turn out. He was hit in the right temple by a shot that appears to have been fired by a soldier of fortune at the intersection of the triple underpass and the picket fence. And then in the back of the head, previously, by a shot fired from inside the Dow Tex by an anti-Castro Cuban. I go through all this as we proceed, but you can get a sense of the enormity of this fanciful story we were told by the Warren Commission. Let's turn to the alleged assassin. Here's that area of the Alchin's photograph, technically known as the Alchin 6, because he's supposed to have taken 6 or 7. The 7th he can't remember having taken because it appears to be a forgery. Now, when we look closer here, we find a number of anomalies. There's a figure standing behind him known as Black Tie Man that's both in front of him and behind him at the same time, which obviously is an optical impossibility. There's a figure here with his hands raised who's had his face blacked out. We call him Black Hole Man, where his shirt has been obliterated and where another figure's face has been obfuscated. There was a lot going on in this little area. Now, if you look at the doorman, he's got a shirt, a t-shirt, a height, a weight, a build that were strikingly similar to those of Lee Oswald when he was arrested. The height, the weight, the build, the shirt, and the t-shirt, where the Dallas Police Department appears to have been so aware of the resemblance that they made him take off his long sleeve, richly textured overshirt before they photographed him for the mugshot, simply wearing his t-shirt. Most certainly not standard procedure. Meanwhile, the government claims a co-worker by the name of Billy Lovelady was actually the man in the doorway, trading on an equivocation because Billy actually also does appear to have been in the doorway. He's simply not the figure leaning out, where the FBI asked him to come in on February 29th wearing the shirt he wore on the day of the assassination, which turned out to be a red and white vertically striped short sleeve shirt, where they took photographs of him unbuttoning the shirt. But even if that was intended to make him look more like the man in the doorway, it's not a long sleeve, richly textured and worn shirt such as was on the man in the doorway. Indeed, now, Larry Rivera has done brilliant work by finding a photograph of both Lee Oswald and Billy Lovelady that are suitable for creating GIFs. And here you can see when he imposes it on the facial features of the man in the doorway, it's an exact fit. In other words, we already had concluded Lee was the man in the doorway based on the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, and the t-shirt. Larry further substantiated that conclusion by discerning that the facial features, the structural features of the man in the doorway were like those of Lee Oswald and not those of Billy Lovelady. So here you have Lee on the left and Billy on the right. It turns out Billy's not a good fit. The ears are wrong. The jaw is wrong. The nose is wrong. The man in the doorway was clearly Lee Oswald, not Billy Lovelady. Here's Billy. He was a man with his hands raised to protect his face from the sun. When Larry did a GIF on the man, Black Hole Man, it turned out to fit Billy Lovelady exactly. So as I was observing, Billy was there in the doorway. He simply wasn't the man in the doorway about which the attention is focused, which was Lee Oswald. But Billy was there. If they hadn't obfuscated his shirt, blacked out his face, it would have been obvious, and added Black Tie Man, which was a real blunder because it meant that the man in the doorway had no left shoulder at all. Otherwise, of course, we had the backyard photograph that was supposed to confirm that Lee Oswald was the bad guy. Well, Jim Mars and I did a co-authored study about the man in the doorway, where we concluded that the man in the doorway who had posed as Lee Oswald was actually a Dallas policeman with ties to the CIA by the name of Roscoe Hoyne. Bear in mind now, when Lee Oswald was shown one of the backyard photographs, he said that was his face posted on someone else's body. Well, Larry went to work on this one too. Jim and I had concluded it was Roscoe White, not only because of the physical features, but because Roscoe had this anomalous bump on his wrist from a wound that never, a broken bone that never healed properly, also on the man in the backyard photographs. So here you'll see where Larry found a photograph of Roscoe White at a beach, and he used it to create a GIF of the man in the backyard photographs. And it was indeed precisely as Lee Oswald had said. It was someone else's body, namely Roscoe White's body, where his face was imposed upon it. And as Jack White observed, there's several of these photographs, and yet everyone has exactly the same facial feature. Here you can see Lee Oswald is much too diminutive to be Roscoe White. Roscoe was a considerably larger guy than Lee Oswald and filled it out completely differently. A relatively recent discovery has been that the autopsy photographs of JFK were not of the body of JFK, the one with the open eyes I said we'd return to, and that Lee Oswald was framed and that the Warren Commission, the Warren Report was a sham. As I've already explained now, we can also prove the backyard photographs were faked by pasting Lee Oswald's face on somebody else, as he claimed, and have identified the body double as Dallas police officer Roscoe White, who, by the way, appears to have been involved in the assassination of some 50 witnesses from Dealey Plaza. 50. So here you can see the profile's just not right. I mean, I got this JFK in this supporting head support, which the Bethesda physicians all said was not present in the autopsy room at Bethesda, but appears to have been present in an adjacent facility where they took additional autopsies. Notice this doesn't look like JFK at all. Look at the jaw, the lips, the nose, the eyes, just doesn't look right. And here, you know, from the angle, that was from the left side. Here is from the right. Once again, we here have a disconnect. All this mess, by the way, was in Groden photographs, which have now been proven to be fake, where the entry at the right temple was in this vicinity, where in some you can see a piece of what looks like black tape imposed over on it. And here you have Larry creating another GIF, where you can see this man in this autopsy photographs, not even JFK. Now, there is a guy in New York City, Robert Morningstar, who believes that Officer J.D. Tippit was the body that was used in the autopsy photographs to fake or sub. Actually, Tippit was subjected to an autopsy report in Dallas by Earl Rose, who was a completely brilliant medical examiner, gave him a very thorough autopsy report. Turns out that Tippit doesn't fit. It's not Tippit. It appears to have been a body in a casket that Dennis David, who is the non-commissioned officer, was in charge of keeping records of who went into and left the autopsy room during the performance of the medical examination, was told not to log in. He was told it was an Air Force major. Well, it may well be. When you got millions of people to choose between, you can find somebody out there who bears a pretty striking resemblance to JFK, and I suspect it was the Air Force major. Now, Ralph Kincaid did absolutely brilliant work. The government has maintained that the Ocean 6 was published too quickly to have been altered in the way in which we have discovered it was altered, claiming a timeline, and produced a half a dozen rather obscure newspapers that they claim showed the photograph was already published the evening of Friday. But what they did, the CIA actually went about creating fake editions of the same newspaper. So here's the News Palladium, the real story it published on Friday. Here's the News Palladium, the fake version that the CIA created to replace in the archives so that students doing research could be deceived by the CIA claiming the photograph had already been published Friday night and couldn't have been altered. How nice. Meanwhile, we have the home movie, the Zapruder film. John Costello did the most brilliant work on the Zapruder film, discovering that it was 98% technically perfect, but that 2% gave it away. The sign, in particular, the Stemmons sign, which appears to have had a bullet hole, which would have disconfirmed, falsified the official report. They took out the Stemmons sign, and when they replaced it, they put it in the wrong location. This demonstrates the sign was placed in the revised film without taking into consideration the optical distortion of camera's lens. It's absolutely fascinating. Here you can see lines. They all should have been parallel if it was real, but they're not. So they move, the sign moves around. Here you can see one of the images where the sign really was in the background, where it is in the film, not the right place. Here's another where it really was versus where it was in the film. Again. And here you see a GIF created by John Costello to show how they replaces the Zapruder, the Stemmons Freeway sign in the Zapruder film in the wrong location, Fascinating stuff. We also have additional proof of the all but motionless spectators. Everywhere else in the motorcade, spectators were waving and cheering enthusiastically. During this portion of the motorcade, however, they're virtually motionless, even though JFK and Jackie are right in front of them. The explanation appears to be the foreground was taken when the pilot car passed and then put into the film using the sophisticated techniques of optical printing and special effects, which enable you to combine any foreground with any background. Here are a couple of typical scenes throughout the motorcade: waving, cheering, wildly enthusiastic. I mean, look at this. Everywhere they were wildly happy. But when you look at the film, you see it's not that way at all. They're just there motionless, talking about the foreground spectators. They should be waving, cheering wildly. It's not that they're completely motionless, it's that they're not reacting to JFK and Jackie. And there you see the Semenstein, which we know was put in improperly, not reacting properly. There are a lot of other moves and changes that were made to what would have been the original authentic film. Meanwhile, we had some 60 witnesses to the limo stop. Some saw it slow dramatically. Others saw it come to a complete stop. The limo slowed dramatically as it came to a complete stop. This was such an obvious indication of Secret Service complicity that it had to be removed. John made a collation of the eyewitness reports you can find at Assassination Science and at assassinationresearch.com, which John and I co-edited. You'll find his report of what the witnesses saw in Dealey Plaza. Dozens and dozens about the limo stop. Some reported seeing it slow dramatically, others that it came to a complete stop, which makes sense, since from different positions, different witnesses would have seen it slow dramatically as it came to a complete stop. Among them is Tony Foster, who was interviewed by Deborah Conway in 2000. As Daniel Gallup has observed, Foster seems to have no idea her recollections contradict the official record. Tony told Deborah, for some reason the car stopped. It did stop for seconds. I don't even know why it stopped. And all of a sudden it sped up and they went under the underpass. I could never figure out why the car stopped. The way she delivers these lines, Gallup observed, I doubt Tony had ever seen the Extant Z film and had no idea her recollections contradict the film. He said he was reminded of David Lifton's early 1971 interviews with the Newmans, who also said that the film had stopped. They had no way of knowing at the time that the Z film showed such stop, since it wouldn't be released to the public until 1975, when Robert Groden got it onto Geraldo's show at that time. All of this is to say the earliest recollections of the individuals are likely to be the most significant, especially if there's evidence of a lack of exposure to contrary viewpoints that might influence memory. For a few more, Willie Lovelady, on the steps of the Scoot Book Depository, we now know he was staying near Lee. I recall that following the shooting, I ran toward the spot where President Kennedy had cars had stopped. Roy Truly, who is Lee and Billy's supervisor in the book Depository, who appears to be a very honest man. The car, I saw the president's car swerve to the left and stop somewhere down in this area. Later, being questioned by Mr. Bellin, and they're all trying to obfuscate what the witnesses are telling them. When you saw the president's car seem to stop, how long did it appear to stop? Mr. Truly, it would be hard to say over a second or two like that. Saying like that, I didn't see, I just saw it stop. I don't know, I didn't see it start up. Mrs. Earl Campbell, this is now the wife of the mayor. Earl Campbell, who it turns out joined the CIA back in 1957. 4 cars behind the presidential limousine at the top of L Street at the time of the shots. I was aware that the motorcade stopped dead still. There was no question about that. Later, as I told you, the motorcade was stopped. Under question by Mr. Hubert, that was when your car at least had come to a standstill? Mrs. Campbell, every car in the motorcade had come to a standstill. We were dead still for a matter of some seconds. I'm reminded of the mayor's wife in the film Music Man, similarly formidable and imposing. Witnesses to the other film. This would have been the Zapruder before it was altered. Irwin Schwartz, William Raymond, Rich Della Rosa, Gregory Burnham, where I've interviewed several of these individuals. Irwin Schwartz was an associate of Abraham Zapruder. He viewed the film in what appears to have been its original state at Eastman Kodak in Dallas, where it was developed. Since nearly 60 witnesses reported the limousine slowed dramatically or came to a complete halt, Vince Palomara explained in his chapter in Murder in Dealey Plaza, my second of the 3 in my original JFK trilogy, that Noel Twyman, who published a brilliant book, Bloody Treason, will address subsequently, asked about the limo stop. He was vague and couldn't recall if the limousine had come to a stop. But when Noel asked him about the effects of the fatal headshot, Schwartz was quite specific and very graphic. He said he had seen Kennedy's head suddenly whip around to the left, and he'd seen an explosion of blood and brains from the head, and it was blown to the left and rear. Twyman pressed him on this crucial point, but Schwartz was emphatic. His account may be found in Bloody Treason, 1997. The other witnesses make important points, including that the other film includes a turn from Houston on to Elm. It shows Greer bringing the limousine to an abrupt halt, so abrupt that it jostles the occupants, that during the limousine stop, JFK is hit twice in the head, once from behind, and he slumps forward. Jackie eases him back up, is looking him right in the face when he's hit from the right front, and then he slumps to the side. He just slumps to the side, where Jackie climbs up onto the back after a big chunk of Jack's skull and brains. Greer watches the whole time, then hits the accelerator. Here is another report about Secret Service agent. Further confirmation of the blowout to the left rear comes from Secret Service agents such as Sam Kinney and Vincent Gullo Jr. Vince Palomara, who's the leading assassination expert on the Secret Service, wrote to Gullo to explain that Kinney had told him of the discovery of a piece of the right rear of the president's skull in the limousine during the flight back to Washington, D.C., and that another member of the detail had become nauseated from observing the blood and gore on the limousine trunk. Gullo confirmed Kinney's statements to Palomara, saying he was totally familiar with the facts as Palomara outlined them. Now, what's striking about this, however, is that in the Zapruder film, the trunk of the car is nice and clean. It's been tidied up. Meanwhile, David, as I may have mentioned, discovered that the autopsy x-rays had been obfuscated, had been patched to conceal the massive fist-sized blowout to the back of the head. Well, here's the area of the patch, area P. which David discovered had been closed up or concealed using a material too thick to be human bone. In fact, he suggested that unless Jack's whole back of the head was nothing but solid bone, unless JFK was a bonehead, in other words, that this had to be an alteration to the x-ray. Well, here, while they had concealed the early frames from 313, 14, 15, 16, 17 by painting it over in black, it occurred to me that they might have overlooked that the wound might be visible in later frames. Now here you can see Clint Hill as he's rushing up to get Jackie to push her back where she's climbing out on the trunk after a big chunk of Jack's skull and brains. But it occurred to me in 374, 375, you might actually be able to see it. So here's a close-up. Remember I talked about that skull flap, where here you can see it blown open. But here's the back of the head, the ghastly wound at the back of the head. It was my suspicion those who were involved in reconstructing the home movies, including the Zapruder, might have overlooked frames past 313 to 316 that display the wound to the back of the head. I found this image of the blowout in frame 374. And here you can see in the earlier frames where it's blacked out, here you can see one where the blob is coming forward, but here you can see the back of the wound, which has not been covered up. It's this, blue-gray. Remember we talk about brain matter as gray matter. Well, it's bluish-gray. It's about the size of a cashew, very much resembles the blowout that David identified at the back of the head, plus, of course, the skull flap. So there it is. Larry Rivera did brilliant work and discovered it's actually visible in earlier frames where they've used the blob to try to create the false impression of blowout to the right front, but where Jackie's glove, her white glove, actually illustrate the massiveness of the defect. So you can see Jackie's right hand. Here you can see her left hand, which provides a background against which you can see the massive defect to the skull. Here you can see outline of its proportions. It was enormous. Meanwhile, you see it enhanced with blender, which is a technique Larry has used in his research. I cannot tell you how much I admire the work of these brilliant guys, David Mantik, the leading expert on the medical evidence in the world, and Larry Rivera, who along with John Costello are the leading experts on the Zapruder film. And here you can see the dimensions of the defect. I mean, it was just horrific. Meanwhile, the motorcycle escort officers. During the limo stop, Jack was hit at least twice in the head. The back of the head, he slumped forward. Jack eased him right back up, looking at him right in the head when he was hit in the right temple by that frangible or exploding bullet that blew his brains out the back of the head and hit Officer Baker with such force that he initially thought he himself had been shot. Now, once they brought the limousine to a halt, that's when they finished off Jack. He was still alive. You got the Cuban coming out and shaking his fist, which appears to have been a verbal signal to the driver Greer to halt. Officer Baker actually dismounted his bike and ran between the cars to the grassy knoll. Officer Jackson, who was on the right, actually rode his bike up the grassy knoll. 5 Secret Service agents dismounted and surrounded the presidential limousine. So here you can see Baker pulling his limousine to the left. There's been a lot of editing, but we have the situation where Hargis parks his bike and runs between the 2 limousines up to the grassy knoll, where Officer Jackson motors his bike right up on the grassy knoll until it falls over and he continues on foot. You have five agents dismounting the Secret Service and surrounding the JFK limousine. Here you can see now grooves in the grass. This is the imprint of Officer Jackson's motorcycle on the grass, showing the marks from driving up the embankment. And here you see Officer Baker actually returning to the bike. Here he is, Bobby Hargis, returning to his bike. This is Beverly Oliver. This is Jean Hill and Mary Mormon. Jean's in the red dress. Mary was taking photographs as a Polaroid. Mary was covering them with the developing fluid. But yet after the assassination, they were approached by agents who didn't identify themselves, who took their photographs. And when Jean was questioned and told them she heard, more than 3 shots, they told her that was impossible. There were only 3 shots. Meanwhile, this brilliant work on the JFK horsemen has been recorded in a couple of wonderful videos by Gary King, where Larry was interviewed by Gary King and me. The JFK Horseman Part 1 and the Jericho Horseman Part 2, a best version that was slightly tweaked. You can find them online. Meanwhile, there were other external inconsistencies. For example, in the Zapruder film, you see how far back Jackie comes and how far forward Clint comes, but they're not actually making contact. Well, there's a very famous film from the other side known as the Nix film, where the Nix and the Zapruder are the two taken from opposite sides that give us the most complete depiction of what actually happened, at least as the government would like us to believe. But here you see Clint Hill moving up and actually making contact with Jackie. She's going further back on the limousine. He's going further forward. They're actually in contact. So look at this stunning difference. Here you have the Zapruder film at the top, where as close as Clint gets to Jackie, they're not actually making physical contact, but in the Nix, they clearly are. Why they had to be fixed? Well, because Jack was hit at least 4 times in the back from behind and the throat from in front, at least twice in the head, once from behind and once from the right front, where there were at least 6 shooters who fired from 8 to 10 shots, possibly more. I'll have more to say about that too. You're often told that you couldn't have had an assassination like this because nobody had talked, and it would have been impossible that nobody had talked. But in Noel Twyman's book, Bloody Treason, on a single page, he addresses a whole lot of individuals who talked, many examples. Let me read this wonderful paragraph. A question's been asked many times. If the killing of Kennedy was a conspiracy involving many people, how could it possibly have kept secret all this time? Why hasn't somebody talked? The answer to that question is simple. A lot of people have talked. The talking started before the assassination and has continued to this day. There are many examples. Carlos Marcello bragged in front of Ed Baker that Kennedy would be killed and described how it would be done. Santo Trafficante Jr. bragged that Kennedy would be killed. Now, these are heads of the crime families, right? The Marcello crime family in New Orleans, Trafficante, the crime family in Tampa, Florida. And later we'll get to Sam Giancana, the mob out of Chicago. Joseph Matier, a right-wing nut down in Florida, bragged that Kennedy would be killed and how it was done. These guys are talking about using a rifle from a tall building. Johnny Rosselli, Sam Giancana's right-hand man, told Jack Anderson years later that Ruby was their man and was ordered to silence Oswald. David Atlee Phillips, who was the CIA for the Western Hemisphere, suspected of being the mysterious Maurice Bishop, which was a fake name, a pseudonym that David Atlee Phillips used, which Larry Rivera has documented, and where Larry and I and Gary King have done show after show after show about all these matters on the new JFK show. Before he died, admitted fringe elements of U.S. intelligence may have been involved in the conspiracy. As well, he would have known since he was actually in the chain of command. As earlier noted, Lyndon Johnson's Mistress Madeline Brown with whom I had over 100 conversations, said that Lyndon Johnson implied before JFK was killed that it was going to happen. Marita Lawrence, a CIA contract agent, who actually was a mistress of Fidel Castro, told in a deposition for a courtroom trial, reported that Frank Sturgis had told her he and a group of anti-Castro Cubans had been involved. Finally, Sam Giancana's brother Chuck revealed in a recent book, Double Cross, that his brother Sam confessed to the crime in 1966 in an hour-long discussion at Chuck Giancana's suburban home in Chicago before Sam was to move to Mexico City. But that book appears to have been misleading, partial, a limited hangout to claim the mob was responsible when there were many parties who were involved, including the CIA, the Dallas Police, the Dallas Sheriff's Office, the U.S. military, Israel, as I'm going to explain. It wasn't just a mob hit, that was a convenient fallback. For example, Chauncey Holt, he was the third of the three chaps who were escorted through Dealey Plaza. Chauncey told me directly and reported on a radio show where he was being interviewed how he'd prepared 15 sets of Secret Service credentials for use during the assassination, that he was working at the Los Angeles Stamp and Stationery Store, where he explained to me that the CIA has many assets with innocuous sounding names, and that he'd worried about getting the color-coded pins that the agents wear, which change from every detail from day to day, but he got them in time. He prepared 15 sets of foreign Secret Service credentials that he was instructed to leave them in a red pickup truck in the parking lot behind the grassy knoll, which most Americans do not know to this day was used by the Dallas Police Department, that the pickup truck wasn't there when he arrived, so he wandered through Dealey Plaza. He said he saw more hitmen and mercenaries than you'd find at a Soldiers of Fortune convention, that he returned to the lot and the pickup truck was there, so he left the credentials, that he was there with Charles Harrelson and another man he knew as Richard Montoya, who turned out to be Charles Rogers. About a whole book has been published, The Man on the Grassy Knoll, where he and Harrelson and Montoya were told to make their escape in a boxcar that would appear to be locked in the railway yard down below the area where the parking lot is located. That when they climbed into the boxcar, they found it was loaded with explosives, ammunition, and weapons. That the train started to pull out and they thought they were making their getaway, but the supervisor noticed something odd and called it back. That when police investigated, they found them and escorted them through Dealey Plaza. A number of anomalies taking place in the process, including an individual walking past them who turned out to be Edward Lansdale, identified by Victor Krulak, a Marine Corps general, and Fletcher Prouty, who was actually his subordinate at the Pentagon, where Lansdale was responsible for orchestrating assassinations around the world, especially in Vietnam, and where a number of us have concluded that Edward Lansdale actually determined the location of the assassinations and the sequence in which the shots would be taken. Where Charles Harrelson, who was arrested for the assassination of a federal judge, where he is the son of Woody Harrelson, the Hollywood actor, admitted to having shot JFK, participating in the assassination, where Jim Hicks was a coordinator for the communications for the assassination, and where he had an antenna hanging out his pocket, as you can see in a photograph taken during the assassination, where Jack Ruby was induced to shoot Lee, although actually claimed he could never remember and where Ralph Sinkay has now, in stunning new research, established that Lee was actually shot by an FBI agent by the name of James Bookout, who dressed in in Jack Ruby's clothing. How the police had taken Jack to a room and had him take off his clothing, which was very odd, but where he had no idea they were putting it on Bookout. So when he shot Lee Oswald, he would be shooting him wearing Jack Ruby's clothing. Fascinating piece of work, completely brilliant. Ralph Sinkay, who's been grossly underestimated. And it was even Ralph who convinced me that, because Ralph is a chiropractor and he's used to helping individuals get physically fit to better wear their clothing, that we knew that it was Lee in the doorway based on the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, and the t-shirt, that we didn't actually need to know the facial features, which Larry Rivera has now confirmed. I published around a dozen blogs about this, inspired by Ralph Sinkay's work. He's the founder of the Oswald's Innocence Project and deserves accolades for his significant contributions, which we've also documented during the new JFK show, where Billy Solestis was a colleague of Lyndon and who confirmed aspects of the assassination, how I will review as we proceed. But if you take all the evidence we've accumulated here, although there are many conspiracy theories about how it was done, that, for example, was a Russian hit, that the KGB assassinated JFK, that it was anti-Castro Cubans, that Fidel was in on it, that it was really his hit team, that it was the mob hit, as I have already observed, where the book Double Cross is documenting that. When you realize that the Zapruder film was altered and massively revised using the special techniques of optical printing and special effects, where Josiah Thompson, for example, someone I once admired, but who turned out to be a cover-up artist for the CIA, maintains that the film couldn't have been altered because of the chain of custody, because it was in the possession of agents of the Secret Service and the Abraham Zapruder, except that a copy was sent to a secret lab run by the CIA near Kodak headquarters in Rochester, New York. One of the copies that was made in Dallas, so that, it was the custodians who actually were participating in the cover-up, by virtue of which, once we know the film was altered so massively based on the medical evidence and the other evidence, the eyewitness testimony, the comparison with the Nix film, we know something's wrong with Josiah's argument. And of course, what he's concealing is that there was Secret Service agents who were involved in the assassination and setting him up. In fact, I discovered more than 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting Jack up for the hit, which meant, of course, that having possession of the film wasn't a form of security. It was a form of transmission of a copy of the film to the Secret Service, where on Saturday, the original was brought to the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, D.C., on the 23rd, Saturday the 23rd, where it was processed by one team led by Bruno Ruglioni, but that another, which appears to have been the real film, and they set up a briefing board with frames from the film. Well, it was an 8mm already split film that had been developed in Dallas, and where they had to contact a shop owner to have him open his store so they could buy an 8mm projector in order to review the film, but where the substitute was brought to the National Photographic Interpretation Center on Sunday, as a 16 millimeter unsplit film developed in Rochester by an agent who identified himself as William Smith. And I wonder if he spelled his name with a Y. That's, I mean, ridiculous. And they made the substitution where it now had merged the two hits, the shot from behind where Jack fell forward, slumped forward, and Jackie eased him back up and was looking him right in the face. When he was hit in the head by the second shot fired from the right rear and then slumped to the left, those rounds were merged in the extant film. So as you can see, you got this violent left into the rear motion, which no witnesses in Dearly Plaza observed. Well, once you know the autopsy x-rays are altered, that there was a substitution of another brain for the brain of JFK, and the Zapruder film was altered, you know the mafia could not have extended its reach into Bethesda Naval Hospital to alter x-rays under control of officers of the U.S. Navy and the medical technicians and Secret Service agents. That anti-Castro Cubans or pro-Castro Cubans could not have substituted another brain for the brain of JFK, that the KGB could not have got its hands on the Zapruder film. There's only a tiny, tiny group that have had anything to do with these events, and they involve the Secret Service, the CIA, and medical officers of the U.S. Navy. So that, as Noel Twyman would observe, he saw that the most perfect combination with the greatest probability of success when you review different theories about how the assassination could have been committed involved a combination of the CIA military with the Secret Service, with the mafia, with LBJ and J. Edgar Hoover, where Hoover, of course, as a director of the FBI, was virtually unassailable. But with LBJ in the conspiratorial group, Hoover could possibly have been relied upon to fall in line because of the mafia having compromised him, just to mention as an aside. Just as J. Edgar Hoover had compromising photographs and records of the sex lives of congressmen and senators, where he'd have one of his agents drop by a senator's office, for example, and explain to the senator, Senator, we just want you to know these photographs have come into our possession, and we want to, this is of the senator with a woman, not his wife, in a sexually compromising position. We want you to know, you can rest assured, Senator, that we're not going to let these photographs fall into the wrong hands. And then as they leave, they'd say, we hope, the director hopes you'll remember the FBI when time comes for appropriations. The mob had compromising photographs of J. Edgar with his close personal friend, Clyde Tolson, so that Edgar was unable to even acknowledge the existence of organized crime until after the Joe Vlacci hearings, which were so specific and detailed it was impossible to deny the organization of the mob thereafter, that Edgar would fall in line because of the mafia having compromised him. Perhaps that risk would seem acceptable to the plotters once they had LBJ in their circle. He would be the most valuable member of the group because he would become president and thereby have immediate authority over the entire executive branch, which includes the Secret Service, the military, the CIA, and the FBI. This represents, as Noel emphasizes, the entire investigative and prosecuting capability of the United States government, with the possible exception of congressional investigations, congressional investigating committees, where LBJ immediately quashed the initial formation of the Congressional Investigative Commission and formed the Warren Commission, with all the appointees selected by himself and Hoover, and all the information available to it was furnished by the FBI. LBJ was the master manipulator of the Democratic Congress. Thus, for my first test, I assumed that at a minimum, the plotters were CIA military, Secret Service, Mafia, LBJ, where, depending on who initiated, all the Mafia had to do is get the CIA involved and have the CIA recruit the Secret Service and LBJ. It would have had a perfect conspiracy. All LBJ had to do was recruit the CIA, who would use the Mafia as needed in the Secret Service, and he had a perfect conspiracy. Hoover would fall in line after the fact when confronted by LBJ and the Mafia with the blackmail material they had on him. In this scenario, the right-wing extremists, if involved at all, would provide money for the assassination. So given all of that, what I'm providing here, the assassination, the actual scenario looked rather like this, where we had the first shot fired, from the top of the county records building here. This was a shot that hit Jack in the back. This was fired by a deputy sheriff by the name of Harry Weatherford, who obtained a .30-06 and bought a small plastic collar to implant a Mannlicher Carcano bullet in JFK's back, where he hired a high-quality professional quality silencer just a few weeks before the assassination. And when he was questioned about it, whether he had shot JFK, he said he shot lots of sons of bitches. And the second shot through the windshield was actually fired from inside the triple underpass. Larry and Gary and I moved there and discovered it's a much better trajectory than where I originally thought on the south knoll here, where there's a lone tree, and moved that shot from inside the triple underpass, where we found there was a fuse box that was perfect for the weapon that was fold-upable. It was one that was a very special weapon fired, manufactured, where the chief of staff of the Air Force, Curtis LeMay, had one of these weapons, and it appears to me to have been the weapon that was used here, that to fire through the windshield hit JFK in the throat, where Greer and Kellerman both knew the shot was coming and braced themselves. I mean, it's so astonishing, that people, unless they actually knew the details of how this was carried out, would have no idea. His name, Jack Lawrence, who actually went to work for the automobile dealership that provided the vehicles for the motorcade. Normally, a presidential motorcade is all uniform black Cadillacs, but in this case, they're all different makes and models, and so that the conspirators knew where everyone was in the motorcade by identifying simply the color and make of the car. He showed up back at the car dealership after the assassination, all muddy, having made his escape through a sewer system beneath the Dealey Plaza, and nauseated from what he had done. Then we had 3 shots fired from the Daltex building, that window in the uranium mining company, by an anti-Castro Cuban by the name of Nestor Tony Escadro, who was actually supervised, believe it or not, by George Herbert Walker Bush, who would be arrested coming out of the building. These were the only shots fired with an unsilenced weapon, a Mannlicher Carcano, 3 shots with 2 misses, one of which missed and hit the chrome strip above the windshield in the limousine. Another missed and hit the curbing and injured James Tague. That led to having to subtract one of the 3 shots were fired, but the third of which succeeded in hitting Jack in the back of the head. Remember, the Mannlicher Carcano was such an unreliable weapon that was known as the humanitarian rifle in World War II for never actually harming anyone in purpose. Then we had shots that were fired from the book depository, but from the opposite side at Ralph Yarborough, at John Connally, in the mistaken belief it was Ralph Yarborough, who was a liberal Texas senator that Lyndon despised. He had a huge argument with JFK that morning to get Connally out and Yarborough in, but where Jack overruled him on the ground that the chief executive of the state ought to ride with the chief executive of the United States, which had the effect of obfuscating the politics of the assassination, because most of the public would never believe that Lyndon Johnson would place John Connally, his campaign ad in the 2020 campaign, and his close personal friend in harm's way. But it happened inadvertently. They tried to get him out, but it was too late to inform the shooters, where the Dow Tech shooter appears to have been Malcolm Max Wallace, who was a wonderful marksman. Madeline Duncan Brown, who was also a good shot herself, said she saw him out at the local skeet shot that's 2 weeks before the assassination and that he never missed. Well, he was in the book depository, the opposite side, firing at Ralph Yarborough in the mistaken belief, and it appears to have inflicted the wounds on Ralph, the back, the chest wound, probably also the wrist and even the thigh wound, all three, where he was Lyndon's personal hitman and had murdered a dozen people for Lyndon Johnson, including one of his own sister, who did too much talking. Then we had Frank Sturgis was actually located at the intersection of the Grassy Knoll and the Triple Underpass. It appears to have fired the shot that entered the right temple and blew his brains out the back of the head. There's a complication there over a recent discovery that I'm going to add. Meanwhile, Roscoe White was on the Grassy Knoll and fired a shot where he pulled his shot, meaning he pulled himself off so he wouldn't hit Jack because it would have injured Jackie. A bullet that wound up in the grass and was picked up by a lieutenant for the Dallas police force. Now, Ole Domagard has identified another shooter in the Pergola area, and the evidence is sufficient to confirm a fellow by the name of Clyde Forshaw, who is representing the Israel and the Brofman crime family in Toronto. I've yet to determine where Clyde shot would have entered. But we have also now, it looks much more plausible given that David Manick has identified a third shot to the head fired from the right, and we have that metallic trail. It may be the metallic trail and the entry in the right temple were caused by two different shots, because James Files, whom I've been heretofore doubted because he didn't identify the limo stop that set up his shot, claimed to have fired a mercury load. And while David has now identified a third shot to the head, I am open to the prospect that it may have been fired by James Files, so that Files' mercury load is a different shot than the shot that blew out the back of the head. And where Files, I mean, you got all these groups and individuals. What it turns out is that the different individuals and groups that were involved appear to have put up their own hitman. So what we have in the Warren Commission report is a complete monstrous cover-up. If you look carefully, even at the inside of the paper book edition, you can see it's showing a reconstruction of the magic bullet that doesn't have the bullet entering the base of the back of the neck, but lower down, and therefore leaves the throat shot as unaccounted for. You have John Connally with his wrist wound. You have the fake location, a weapon that wasn't used to assassinate JFK. Now, the easiest way to think about it is to draw a distinction between the sponsors, the facilitators, and the mechanics. The mechanics were the shooters, their supervisors, and the coordinators, who, as you now know, included George Herbert Walker Bush and Edward Lansdale. The sponsors were the individuals in group who wanted Jack out, primarily in order to replace them with the policies represented by Lyndon Johnson. But they included the CIA. Jack was threatening to shatter the agency into 1,000 pieces. The chiefs of staff of the military. Jack had opposed them when they unanimously recommended invading Cuba. He'd also oppose them when they unanimously opposed the signing a test ban treaty with the Soviet Union. And now he was going to pull all our forces out by the end of 1964 of Vietnam, where they felt a stand had to be taken against the expansion of the international communist conspiracy. It was a false theory, but they believed in it. They wanted the war in Vietnam. The anti-Castro Cubans wanted to punish Jack because he had abandoned them at the Bay of Pigs, or so they believe. Actually, Jack had made it clear from the beginning the U.S. was not to be involved. So the CIA allowed the impression to be made that he had been involved and wouldn't provide the close air support, which he'd never promised. The mafia was upset because Bobby was, exploring international. The mafia was prosecuting. The mafia was such success, bringing so many indictments and prosecution, they were being wiped out. When they believed, truly or falsely, they'd had an agreement with Joe Kennedy, Bobby and Jack's father, that if Jack were elected, if they helped him get elected, that he would not go after the mob. So they felt there had been a double cross. Let me just mention already, see, for a CIA, for a joint chief shooter, you got the Air Force expert Jack Lawrence. A CIA shooter may have been Frank Sturgis, who was working with the CIA and the mob and running guns into Cuba. Texas oilman shooter, we got Malcolm Mac Wallace, who was actually Lyndon's shooter. Israel was upset because Jack was at loggerheads with David Ben Israel, who was a founder of Israel and the first prime minister who wanted Israel to create nuclear weapons, which Jack opposed. And Clyde Forshaw appears to have been the Israeli shooter representing the Bronfman in Israel. And the Fed, we've now discovered there's another shooter on the grassy knoll who I've seen photographs in the possession of Rick Russo and Ed Tatro, where you can see him, two different photographs holding his rifle. You wouldn't have thought there was any room for a shooter there. And it may be then that he was a shooter representing the Fed. Of course, you had Roscoe White representing the Dallas Police Department, and you had the shooter from the Texas from the top of the book depository for the Dallas Sheriff's Office. So you had really, each of them seems to have put up their own shooter. The facilitators, however, were Lyndon Johnson of the assassination and J. Edgar of the cover-up. Noel Twyman's book is probably the single book that got it right. Noel Twyman, published in 1967. Texas in the Morning by Madeline Duncan Brown. She reported how she had an affair with Lyndon. It started in 1952, where she bore a son, Stephen, to Lyndon in 1970. Not his only child, but his only son, that she was invited to many social activities because of a relationship to Lyndon, which was well known, that she was at home of Clint Murchison Sr., which was a ratification meeting the night before the assassination, that J. Edgar was there, that she thought it was in his honor, but others were there. That when Lyndon Johnson showed up late in the evening, the heavy hitters disappeared into a boardroom for about 20 minutes. When they broke up, Lyndon strode over toward her. She thought he was going to whisper sweet nothings. Instead, he told her in a hateful tone of voice that after tomorrow, he wasn't going to have to put up with embarrassment from the Kennedy boys any longer. That wasn't a threat. That was a promise. During a rendezvous they had at the in Austin at a hotel there on New Year's Eve, she confronted Lyndon with rumors rampant in Dallas at the time that he's been involved, and he blew up at her and told her that the oil boys and the CIA had decided that Jack had to be taken out which is about as close as we get to a direct confession. You can read about it in her book, Texas in the Morning, where she explained that when Lyndon would get up in the morning, throw up in the window and just bellow out, "God, I love Texas in the morning." Where Billy Solestis knew several of those who were involved, including Mac Wallace and Cliff Carter, who was Lyndon's chief administrative assistant, how he became suspicious that they'd both been involved in the assassination conversation he had with them, where Billy Saul was involved in many swindles of the American government, where a federal marshal actually was sent down to investigate and was killed by Lyndon's personal hitman, where Bob McClellan explained how he was working in the law office of Ed Clark, who was one of the most powerful, and how Lyndon used Ed Clark in his office to arrange it, how the third of the tramps was not E. Howard Hunt, but Chauncey Marvin Holt, as I've explained, but where Edward Hunt gave a confession to his son, whom I have met, about the chain of command in the assassination, how it went from Lyndon Johnson to Cord Meyer, who was then the director of the CIA's covert operations, to David Atlee Phillips, to William Harvey, to David Sanchez Morales, and then to the shooters in Dallas. That was a chain of command, and we have multiple confirmations of it, where Jack Ruby said, "Gentlemen, I want to tell the truth, but I can't tell it here. If you want to share a fair shake out of me, you have to take me to Washington." When I mentioned Adlai Steven, and if he had been president, vice president, there would never have been an assassination of our beloved President Kennedy. Asked if he would explain it again. Ruby continued, "Well, the answer is the man in office now." And they asked him, "What are you meaning that Lyndon Johnson was involved?" And he answered, "Yes." A brilliant book by Fred Nelson, LBJ, mastermind of the JFK assassination. You have only to read the first couple of chapters of this book to become convinced. Here you see the photographs of the tramps walking through, where Edward Dansdale there is walking past them. He had a distinctive ring and a distinctive walk and a problem with his hand that led his identification, where we have other photographs then of George Herbert Walker Bush in front of the book depository, where he was arrested coming out of the Daltex building. One of the sheriffs reported on his arrest. No records were kept, but we have that photograph of him in front of the building. We have the photograph of Lansdale walking past the tramps, and another photograph of Lansdale waiting to speak to Bush. Here's a photograph that really says it all. The assassination plan appears to have originated in 1960 at the presidential convention, where Lyndon Johnson was running with, against JFK for the nomination. Jack, having secured the nomination, having defeated Lyndon, invited Stuart Symington of Missouri to be his running mate. But he gave Stuart the night overnight to think about it. Bobby, meanwhile, went past the Lyndon Johnson suite and made the pro forma gesture of inviting him to run with JFK, never expecting he'd have the least interest, since he was the powerful majority leader. And the vice presidency was regarded as not worth a bucket of warm piss. You hear the weaker version of a bucket of warm spit, but the original wasn't worth a bucket of warm piss. Bobby was simply dumbfounded when Lyndon leaped on the invitation and insisted he be the running mate for JFK. He threatened to expose that Jack had Addison's disease and wasn't expected to live a long, healthy life, that among his many dalliances was one with a woman from East Germany who was a spy, and that if he were not on the ticket, then any legislative proposal sent down by the White House would be dead on arrival because, as the powerful majority leader, he would bottle them up. Jack and Bobby tried to figure a way out, but they were unable to do so and had to accede to Lyndon's demands. When one of Lyndon's wealthy backers learned that Lyndon would be on the ticket with JFK, he burst into the Johnson suite cursing and swearing that now Lyndon will help JFK become president. Bobby Baker took him into a bedroom and explained what they had in mind. He came out all smiles, saying he thought that was an excellent plan. Bobby Baker would later declare that JFK would not live out his first term and that he would die a violent death. In the course of events, Lyndon Johnson would send his chief administrative assistant, Cliff Carter, down to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination. Meanwhile, in addition to my trilogy, Assassination Science, 1998, Murder in Dealey Plaza, 2000, and The Great Zapruder Film Hoax, 2003, I've now published a fourth collection of expert studies on the assassination, JFK, Who, How, and Why, Solving the World's Greatest Murder Mystery, available at Moonrock Books. I simply conclude by saying that doing research with these excellent people, world authority on the human brain, leading expert on the medical evidence, the two giants of the Zapruder film, John Costello and Larry Rivera, has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. And I'm continuing my efforts to bring the truth to the American people because they deserve to know the facts of their own history, which you have here. What happened to JFK? The Warren Commission, alas, was a massive cover-up. They got it wrong on purpose, sad to say. And now you know the rest of the story. Thank you for watching. And during my next two reports of the conspiracy guy, I'll be addressing an effort to reopen a legal inquest into the death of JFK, which he was entitled to, but never received from the state of Texas. Thank you for joining me tonight.